So now let's look at the prophetic profile. Here's a graph. This is really neat. The promises are postscripted, and he that has, the promises of what's, if you pass your test, what's given to you in the first group, and then the second group, you'll notice in this chart that stands out, as soon as we look at this chart, the promises are tucked in within the body of the letter. As well as you'll notice that these 4 churches at the very end, there are explicit references to a second coming. Things that Jesus taught in the Gospels about his return will be mentioned in these last 4 churches, these last 4 letters. What does that mean? Friend, I believe this speaks to how at the very end, just before his return, that final generation, there will be earmarks or things about the characteristics of each of these 4 letters revealed in the church or throughout Christendom in that final generation. There will be characteristics mentioned in the letter to Thyatira present in the last generation church. Things mentioned in Sardis that will be present in the last days church. Okay, and so in the final generation, Philadelphia, Laodicea. On this prophetic profile, now in this alignment, if you were to have Jesus write the letters in any other order, what I'm about to present to you could not happen. If he wrote to any of the other churches at any of the other cities, what I'm about to present to you could not happen. Through the lens of human history, the way the cities were. It is so amazing why these 7 churches. You see, each city in its historical involvement throughout human history portrays literally descriptives within those letters. That is so amazing. For example, the Church of Ephesus, you know how they were so overly on doctrine, right? That you read, they kind of lost their devotion. They chose doctrine over devotion. They lost their first love. Well, in the city of Ephesus, historical documentation teaches you of the immense library of information, and it was the central hub of early church history. The first century church, there was over 250,000 Christians to have gone through the church, through the city of Ephesus on a regular basis. How amazing is that? And notice it's coined as the apostolic church. You see, this first part of human history through the church age, this first century church, they were so dead set on the doctrine. And notice it was in these first handful of decades after Christ's ascension that we would see the writings, the apostolic letters being penned, the instructions to the church, the instructions of how we are to live out our lives and to spread the gospel to the ends of the world. All that was done in this first stage, this Ephesus. And notice Ephesus, in the letter to Ephesus, is the only letter it mentions the word apostles. And it says that he says, you have found them to be liars, these false apostles. That is so amazing. We were that out of all the other churches there in the first century, Ephesus was mentioned first in this 7-letter delivery. How amazing is that? Smyrna wasn't first. Berea wasn't first mentioned. No, it was rather the one known for apostolic diligence and laying down the foundation for the church. And lo and behold, when we look through the lens of human history, the first century church, Ephesus, would be the tethering image to that first time frame of the church age. Wow. The next letter Jesus gives to John to write specifically is Smyrna. This is the persecuted church. There, after that first century church, the persecution got horrible. with the Roman emperors. As a matter of fact, in Smyrna, in the letter of Smyrna, notice how there was 10 days specifically. 10 days of persecution, this tribulation caused by the devil, right, for 10 days. Ironically enough, throughout the human history of the church age, there were 10 Roman emperors in a row that had killing sprees and persecution campaigns specifically against Christianity. 10 in a row. There was not one break. Who finally brought the break was Constantine. And as a matter of fact, we're going to get to him in just a second. So Smyrna represents the persecuted church, okay? The second letter wasn't Philadelphia. No, the second letter specifically was Smyrna. Smyrna, the root word for Smyrna is myrrh. Myrrh is associated with the deceased and embalming. It was an embalming element, if you will. It helped keep the odor down, okay? So myrrh is always associated with death. This is another picture and being indicative of why there's no myrrh presented to Jesus during the millennial reign. During his first coming, there was gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In the millennial reign, only gold and frankincense given. Gold, deity, frankincense, authority, and then myrrh. Myrrh is not given to him. Why? Because in his first coming, he had already died. Myrrh deals with the death. And so here, it wasn't Pergamos, the second church, no, Philadelphia. So during the time of the 10 emperors in a row, 10 increments of time, this letter to Smyrna was written. Friend, how amazing is that? Pergamos. Pergamos is the third one. And if you look at the lens of human history throughout the church age, after Constantine came in the 300s AD, he brought a leadership that was pro-Christian. So that first handful of decades under Constantine's, influence over the church, there was elevation of the church. There was this concept of how do we change the holidays into becoming more evangelistic. It was during this next stage of human history where we had celebration to the goddess Astarte, Easter, we were able to influence the world with the resurrection of Christ. And so the concepts of Passover and resurrection of Jesus. This is so great, friend. During this time as well, when everyone was celebrating the issue of Babylonian practices and the Yule log and all this stuff, we were able to celebrate the birth of Christ, the Son, S-O-N, of God, not just celebration of the pagan practices of the S-U-N, Son, but now we were able to influence the world with a celebration of the Son of God, S-O-N. Now, what happened by doing that, we ended up becoming so familiar with having popularity and influence during this time of human history through the church age that after the 300s going into the 400s, we became what's known as the married church, where we just begin to marry the things of this world, and we kind of confuse and blur the lines of what's spiritual and to be held in high standards, and with just doing things to get public influence. And that, my friend, began a very dark time. This is the entrance into what human history calls the Dark Ages, where the church began to lose her light. Now, was she extinguished? No. There's always a remnant. But what happened is after the married phase of the church going into the Dark Ages is this allowing of the medieval church to come in, Thyatira. And notice to the letter of Thyatira was this issue of Jezebel. Okay, this harlot, if you will, of false teachings and horrible practices come to ride in on the grips of authority. This is when, unfortunately, for centuries, the church would come to learn the Inquisitions, horrible, torturous practices of wrong authority figures. Anything that was truly trying to just live for God and in the right way, it would be snuffed out by the practices of church authority, quote unquote church, not the true church. This is in name only. Now, what that did was it granted the Protestant movement in the 1500s. Okay, during the Reformation, the protest, that's what the word Protestant means, protest. Martin Luther protested, and so there was just enough groundswell in the 1500s that when people had had enough, this is it, we're willing to make a stand en masse. We had the Protestant movement, we had the Reformation, okay? So we broke away from Roman Catholicism and started our own movements, if you will. The church began to rise up, cry out, and overthrow the horrible practices of Jezebel and leadership, overthrow that, and became what's known as the denominational church. Sardis, notice in the letter, it says a name that is given. There's this specific highlight of the name. Well, after the Reformation, Protestant people groups that had similar interpretations of Scripture would come together, and they would create denominational movements. And so for the next century or two, we see in the prophetic profile of the church age that there is a vast movement to have a name. Well, we're the first church of fill in the blank, first church of fill in the blank. And so you had all these different movements that held to a specific name. And if you notice, Sardis, well, the history, now let me add a little bit of prophetic history to the town Sardis. It was up on a cliff, right? It was next to perfect in its ability to be sustained. No one knew how to penetrate the city. No one knew how to overtake the city. Well, because of a loose-fitted bet, if you will, there was a little dare between two of the opposing forces, two of the guys, of the warriors that were, they had the city sieged up, sort of, but it was impenetrable. Anyways, well, this one guy found out a secret scenario of rock structures in which, if because he was of a certain stature, build, whatever, he figured out a way to climb up the cliff to sneak in undetected. And lo and behold, as a thief in the night, that's how they were conquered. And if you notice this, the letter to Sardis, behold, I come as a thief, right? And so Jesus, who also knows the future history of that city, gives an indication of how they will be taken down by surprise like a thief in the night. Friend, this is so amazing how the letter Sardis, Jesus made sure this was after Thyatira and before Philadelphia. Why? Because it fits perfectly into this prophetic profile. If you have these letters in any other arrangement, this could not work as a prophetic profile throughout church history, but it works perfect in its timing of delivery from the angel to John, as well as the unfolding of history and its descriptions, and where it's placed in order when we look back through the lens of history. This is so fascinating, friend. The next phase of the church age would be the Philadelphia church, the missionary church. After all these denominational movements begin to go up, and you had studies and universities launched, well, you had a high thrust to bring the gospel to the nations after all these denominational movements began, because every one of them had the right heart. Missions. How do we win the world for Jesus? Jesus said, occupy till I return, until I come back, go make disciples of all nations. And so now that we have the printing press making copies of the Bible, we have people learning the Bible in their own languages. By now, the Bible is being interpreted into a lot of the modern languages. Everyone can read the Bible for themselves, and when you read the Bible for yourself and you have a heart for the Lord, you gain his heart for missions, and you're sent out and you begin to go. And notice in the letter to the church of Philadelphia, he will open doors. Remember the Apostle Paul? He made this phrase. He said, pray that I would have an open door. Pray that I would have an open door to preach the gospel. You see, this is where the launching of winning the nations comes into play. And then Jesus said that the final generation, the earmarker to start it all off, in the final generation, Matthew 24, he says that this gospel will go to the ends of the world, and then the end shall come. Matthew 24:14. So we have, when the gospel is going into all the world, then that final generation can finally show up. And so there's a convergence of technology, the missions movement, and the human race is ready. The times of the Gentiles are now being fulfilled. As a matter of fact, Jesus said that you'll know that the times of the Gentiles are over and done, and we're entering into that phase of the final generation when Jerusalem is no longer trodden under the foot of the Gentiles. Once that happens, once Jerusalem comes back out from underneath the foot of the Gentiles to Jewish control, then you'll know that everything is set up. Well, that happened in 1967 in the Six-Day War. The Israeli forces pushed the Jordanians past Jerusalem and recaptured Jerusalem in 1967. Friend, that's when I believe the clock started on the final generation, because now all the technology is in place, everything is here to begin to implement the system of that final fourth beast, the world empire, the system of Antichrist, that it seems almost impossible to get free out of, and that's in Daniel chapter 7. All right, so the Church of Laodicea. So then here we have, after the big mission movement, in the final generation, the church is the sleepy church, the one that has vision issues, eye issues. They need eye salve. They need to recapture the vision. There's a loss of a heart for missions. There's a loss of vision for what it's truly about. As a matter of fact, in this apostate church phase, if you will, many Christians, are they going to heaven? Yes. Do they have a lot of lack of drive to do work for the Lord? Yes. There's this weird self-deceptive, this being hearers of the word but not doers. You become self-deceived, as the book of James says, into thinking that you're okay. And, well, I go to church or I watch church online or something, but I don't actually do the teachings of Jesus myself. And because of that, we're self-deceived, and then we end up having to, in order to get out of this sleepy condition, we think we're rich, but we're really poor. We think we're all clothed, but we're truly naked. We have the wrong perspective of self than what Jesus says. We have to purchase gold tried by the fire. We've got to be willing to pay the price. We've got to be willing to do what it takes to get the right heart back. And when you're slumbering and you're a couch potato, you don't want to get up. You have lack of drive, lack of initiative. And that is a huge earmarker in this last stage church, this kind of wishy-washy. You're not completely hot, but you're not completely cold. You like to ride the fence, you're right there in the middle. You have a lot of that in this last bit of church history. So friend, here is the prophetic profile